So next, we are going to get the panel started. So thank you to everyone who opened up this morning. And thank you again to Asia Sparks. So I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch. I'm going to introduce our moderator, and then we have a panel opener as well that I'll introduce after that. So, Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch is from the historical African Nova Scotian community of Beachville and Cherry Brook. Dr. Hamilton-Hinch is an assistant professor in the School of Health and Human Performance. Her work examines the impact of structural, systemic, and institutional racism on diverse populations, particularly people of African descent. Dr. Hamilton-Hinch is the Healthy Populations Institute flagship project co-lead, improving the health outcomes of people of African descent, one of the founders of the Imhotep Legacy Academy, co-chair of Promoting Leadership and Health for African Nova Scotians, or PLANS program, and co-chair of the Faculty of Health, Diversity, and Inclusion, and an IRCA writer. So please welcome Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch. And so we're going to have our panel opener, and then it's going to go over to our moderator. So we are going to introduce our first panel opener, Bernadette Hamilton-Reed, to just share some sentiments on the topic. So Bernadette Hamilton-Reed is an 8th generation African Nova Scotian woman who grew up in the nation of Beachville. Whoop, whoop. That's going to be a thing for the day. Where she still participates actively in church and in community life. If you know Bernadette, you can never pin down where she is in the world. If you have her on Facebook, you already know. I don't have to say anything. Bernadette also has strong lineage to the Preston Township. Whoop, whoop. And is proud of her ancestry. Bernadette has been married to Carl Reed, the love of her life, for over 30 years, and they have 2 beautiful adult daughters, Allison, who is a fitness trainer and online wellness coach out of Mississauga, Los Angeles, and Sam, who's an artist, facilitator, consultant, youth worker. Bernadette she has been employed with the African Nova Scotian Decade for People of African Descent Coalition for the last 4 years as the executive director of operations, and was recently, She's recently appointed as the executive director in June 2023. Bernadette loves serving and assisting the African Nova Scotian community across the province, combating anti-Black racism. DPAD was instrumental in getting street checks banned and starting the creation of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute to make changes in the justice system for people of African ancestry. Please welcome Bernadette Hamilton-Reed.
I get the big mic, oh my. Good morning, everyone. You know, I'm excited to be here. I love being around Black people. We are so beautiful. You all look so wonderful. So like Sean, I'm gonna try to stay to notes because I could talk for hours about who we are as Black people. We are lovely, we are beautiful, we are everything. But first I wanna start off with our definition because that is what, it doesn't define us, but we've been working on that with DPAD and the African Nova Scotian strategy with the Dalhousie and all that. So I know that a lot of people that are here already know it, but you know, it's nice to repeat it and often hear it again and again and again so that we understand who we are and those who don't know understand who we are. So Nova Scotians, as a distinct people, we descend from free and enslaved Black planters, Black loyalists, Black refugees, Maroons, and other Black people who inhabited the original 52 land-based Black communities in that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia, and whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. It is this definition that defines who we are as we define ourselves. And that has been worked on for, it's come to fruition now, but it has been worked on from our ancestors for many years. And the 52 land-based communities, and I know there's a plethora of people out there that we also need to acknowledge. As Dorico says, part of DPAD's job is to tour the province, and to let people know who we are and how we can assist them. So I'm going to shout out our 52 historic Black communities, and if you are from one, let's hear the woo-woo. So I'm going to try to get them all. If I miss somebody at the end, let me know. So we have Acasiaville, Africville, Aldershot, Amherst, Antigonish, Beachville, Birchtown, Cambridge, Cherrybrook, Hoboken Road, Conway, Danvers, Dartmouth, Digby, East Preston, Gibson Woods, Place Bay, Granville Ferry, Greenville, Halifax, Hammonds Plains, Hasset, Englewood, Jordantown, Kentville, Lake Loon, Lakeel, Lincolnville, Liverpool, Lucasville, Maroon Hill, Middleton, Monastery, Mulgrave, New Glasgow, New Waterford, North Preston, North Sydney, Shelburne, Southville, Spring Hill, Sunnyvale, Sydney, Three Mile Plains, Trenton, Truro, Upper Big Tracadie, Weymouth Falls, Whitney Pier, Yarmouth. Who did I miss? Bear River. Okay. Windsor. Upper Hammonds Plains. Upper Hammonds Plains. No Glasgow again. Oh, Wayne wants New Glasgow again. No, we didn't do New Glasgow enough. So as you can see, my voice is going because I just get so filled up with knowing that how can we not be distinct people? With all that we have persevered. And I know, Asia, thank you for that poem with Tupac. And it's almost, I was in Ontario with the Honorable Jean Augustine said also, we know where they put us in the lands, up in the barren lands where there's rocks, and they didn't think we would survive. So again, they thought we were seeds, but they didn't. They thought they planted seeds. I always get these wrong, right? Somebody help me. They thought they buried us, but they didn't know we were seeds. That's it. Right? They thought they buried us, but they didn't know we were seeds. We have sprung up and we are resilient because of that and because of our ancestors and because of the shoulders that we stand on. Everything that we do and say is because of our distinction. What we want to be recognized as a distinction is it's not about resources, it's about our legacy. It's about who we are as a people to make sure that 400 years, we were formed before Canada, 100 years before Canada was even known. We formed the formulation of Nova Scotia and Canada and the world. And the world needs to know that of our contributions. And why are we still suffering? Why is there still not equity in so many places? Why is that still happening? And why are people afraid to see us in management positions? We are always just one person. We cannot change all your policies. We can only, we can only make sure our voice is heard. And our voices need to be at those senior management tables because that's where decisions are made. We need to become more policymakers. Now, this is a year of councillors running. I hear that Andre Anderson is going to run in Upper Hammonds Plains. We need to get behind that young man and support him. Okay, we also know that Lindell Smith is not reoffering. We need to find somebody to run for him in that area. We need to be politicians. We need to be at those tables and make people know that African Nova Scotians are distinct because we bring a distinct voice and we bring a distinct legacy. I know you're going to hear from Professor Michelle Williams about all the stuff that's been going on, so I don't want to read a lot of stuff from there, but I know that it has been very useful. Because people of African ancestry are descendants of those people who settled these historic Black communities in Nova Scotia. We asserted the term African Nova Scotians for ourselves because, just like the Acadians have asserted themselves as Francophones, you cannot go into an Acadian community and be a Francophone, but they have made the community much open for other Francophones to come. And that's what we as African Nova Scotians are doing. Because of who we are, because of the love and the empathy that we have for everybody, by having our own distinctness, we are not leaving anybody behind. We love our brothers and sisters from the continent. We love the Caribbeans. If you have this color skin, we are supporting you. You come to us, we will help you. The African Nova Scotia Justice Institute is there for you. DPAD is there for you. Our heart goes out to anybody of African ancestry because when the world looks at you, they don't ask where you're from. They just see this when you walk into a room, right? So we have to make sure that, as Shauna said, unity. It's all about unity. And unity in the community is so important that we understand that. So as the Acadians are to Francophones, a well-defined and supported African-Canadian community is to the Nova Scotians. A strong, well-defined African Nova Scotian definition and community has made for more welcoming Nova Scotians for more recently arrived persons of African ancestry. In fact, African Nova Scotians have a long history of welcoming and integrating into their homes and their hearts many of our recent arrived siblings. There's many of us that can trace our ancestries, myself as a Black loyalist, to Sierra Leone. If anybody visits from Sierra Leone, come home. Come home with me. Come visit with me. Come eat with me. That's what we do. If you're able to trace your history to Nigeria or Ghana, if you know somebody's in a need, you go to those people and you bring them into your house. That's who we are as people of African ancestry, and especially African Nova Scotians, because that's what our grandmothers taught us, that's what our great-grandmothers taught us, and that's what we do. And that's what we do. And that's what people need to understand, that we're not asking for anything that doesn't belong to us. We just want you to understand that we are distinct because of who we are and what we have done and how long we have survived for over 400 years. The United Nations even recognizes us as a distinct people in the UNGA report of the working group of experts. And when they came here in 2016, they saw the resiliency of us. And they said, you need to form yourselves and you need to make sure that the world understands the contributions that African Nova Scotians have made to the world. Now I'm going to show out some of our organizations, because as an African Nova Scotian community, and for being as small as we are, we have had mighty, mighty leaders. And I can't list them all because there's too many. We can go back to Calvin Ruck, and I'm going to start listing some, right? I said I wasn't going to. You know, the Rocky Jones, the Carrie Best, Senator Olivers. But anyway, there's my timer, but I'm going to give you 2 seconds, guys, because I'm trying to stick to the time. Because let me tell you need to know these organizations. So we'll start with the Black United Front. The Nova Scotia Advancement for the Advancement of Colored People. These are going to be out. 902 Man Up. The Afrocentric Learning Institute. Arts, Community, Culture, and Economics. African Culture Enrichment Supplementary Program. The African Diaspora Association of the Maritimes. African Nova Scotian Affairs. African Nova Scotian Music Association. African Nova Scotian Office of Integration of HRM. African United Baptist Association. The African Global Congress. African Nova Scotia Education Program. Afro-Scotian Collective. Association of Black Social Workers. Black Business Initiative. Black Cultural Center. Black Educators Association. Council on African Canadian Education. Cumberland African Nova Scotian Association. Cultural Academic Enrichment Program, Delap's Cove Black Indian Pioneer Society, Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute, Department of Early Childhood Development and Education, African Canadian Services Branch, Game Changers 902, Health Association of African Canadians, Imitap's Legacy Academy, In My Own Voice, Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Program, Nova Scotia Brotherhood Initiative, Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, Nova Scotia Sisterhood Initiative, Nova Scotia Brotherhood Initiative, People's Counseling Clinic, Promoting Leadership and Health for African Nova Scotians, Soulfit Environmental Dump Society, the Prep Academy, Transition Year Program, United Negro Improvement Association, Valley African Nova Scotian Development Association. Are we not great people? Are we not great people? Have we not accomplished so much in so little time? And are we not recognized for what we have done? African Nova Scotians, we've got it going on. Thank you very much. Am I sitting too, or am I done? Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. I'm sure that's on Facebook Live somewhere. So I want to transition us into the panel. And so from there, just a quick transition. I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch, introduce our panelists, and get the panel started.
I was getting ready to set up my living room because I know it's a straight line, and I know we want to talk with each other and talk with you as well. So really honored to be here this morning to lead us in this panel discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. I mean, we know there's been lots of discussion going on for the past many years about this important topic, and I'm so glad that many of you have joined us this morning. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and as I introduce them, I just ask that they come on up and take a seat. We recognize that one of the panelists that we had hoped could be here is mourning right now. Her uncle passed away, so we give and lift the Wright family up in prayer in trail on the passing of Ivan Wright. And those are the things we do as a community. So thank you. So Professor Michelle Williams holds a BSW from Dow, an LLB from Toronto, and an LLM from New York University. She teaches criminal law and African Nova Scotians and the law, has served as an academic researcher on restorative justice. She served as Dalhousie's Provost Fellow and continues to co-lead the university's African Nova Scotian strategy. She served as the inaugural chair of Sherlock's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. She served as director of the award-winning Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Initiative from 2004 to 2020, and as a member of the African Nova Scotian Access to Justice Judicial Committee. Watershed Legal Projects Board, formerly Canadian Centre for Legal Innovation and Sexual Assault Response, and the African Nova Scotian UN Decade for People of African Descent Coalition. Don't ask how she gets to do all this stuff in her busy life, because she's very, very active at Dalhousie. I'm very fortunate to be able to call Michelle my friend. In the latter capacity, she worked with the Coalition's Justice Strategy Working Group on a range of legal issues, including eradicating street checks, the use of African Nova Scotian impact of race and cultural assessments, and the establishment of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute. And although it's not here, I just also want to credit Michelle and some members of her team for really enforcing a critical race course at Dalhousie that's mandatory for all Dalhousie University students to take. Very, very important. And they also, and I get to do it each year, and I look forward to it, they tour the Black communities to get a better understanding of our African Nova Scotian heritage and history. So I want to applaud Michelle for her leadership in that course. Our next panelist, and I saw him zoom in, is Isaac Saney. Oh, okay. So Isaac is a Black Studies and Cuba specialist and is the coordinator of Dalhousie's Black and African Diaspora Studies program. He's also taught Black Studies and served as director in Dalhousie's Transition Year program, the groundbreaking program established in 1970 to reduce the educational barriers and injustices that confront the Mi'kmaq Nation and other Indigenous people in the African Nova Scotian community. His teaching, research, and scholarship encompasses Africa, the Caribbean, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, Cuba, and Black Nova Scotia history. He is the author of Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, which at its time of publication was described as a tour de France, a must-read and found on the required reading list of many undergraduate and graduate courses in the field. His recent book, Africa's Children Return, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid Ends, is considered an authoritative account of Cuba's role in liberating Namibia and South Africa. Isaac is also a recipient of the Dalhousie's President Award for the Advancement of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusiveness. He's a longtime community activist and advocate whose roots lie in the Black Nova Scotian community and the Caribbean. So Isaac, if you can come join us. Delvina Bernard is our next panelist. As an agent for social change, I utilize education, music, and artistic approaches to open minds and hearts to online oppressive practices, to transform daily intentions and actions in spiritual labor that yields a more just and harmonious world. So Delvina is 8th generation African Nova Scotian who traces her family roots to the Black loyalists of 1783, Yarmouth and Laquille, and the Black refugees of 1812, Lake Loon, Cherrybrook, Guysborough Road. For more than 30 years, Delvina has dedicated her professional and personal life as an educator, senior administrator, cultural analyst, musician, to developing strategic initiatives aimed at dismantling all forms of systemic discrimination. As an institutional change strategist and social justice advocate, Delvina has led the design and implementation of numerous educational, cultural, and economic development programs to advance and upskill historically marginalized, underrepresented, equity-deserving groups. Delvina has traveled globally as an ambassador for anti-racism, anti-poverty, and gender justice causes, and has received regional and national awards for her leadership in the arts, education, and international development. Delvina is currently employed as the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Accessibility Advisor at Mount St. Vincent University. She holds degrees in business, adult education, and lifelong learning. She is currently a part-time PhD student at St. Mary's University, conducting qualitative research on economic models for reparative justice. So if you can join me in welcoming Delvina. And I'm going to join us here. And if you're all okay, fine sitting straight, that's good. I was trying to angle you a little bit. I'm going to pull my table over here so I can put my notes here. Yeah, that's your mic. They all should be on. So thank you for joining us this morning. Looking forward to some really important conversations. We're also hoping that you'll engage with us as well. I know we're a little bit behind time. We're going to do our best to catch up because this is an important topic. So our topic is understanding African Nova Scotians as a distinct people. And Bernadette opened it up quite nicely, getting us motivated and inspired to think more about this topic. So we're going to have it as a conversation. I have a couple of guided questions, but feel free to just contribute where you want to get in. So I'm going to just start with some general questions, and any of you can take some of these questions as we go through. So one of my first questions that I want to ask you about, did you want to check the mics? I saw Delvina just do a check.
You always have to check the mic.
That's that button, yeah.
Check.
Check, check.
Okay, we're good. You saw the artist, we should check, and I was like, oh, I didn't have them do that.
We missed our sound check.
Well, we're good now. Everyone's all good now. You can all hear them. So when we think about the understanding the African Nova Scotian as a distinct people, what policies or initiatives have been successful in addressing the needs and concerns of African Nova Scotians? And what gaps do you still think exist? And this is just a general question to anyone. So thinking about some of the policies and initiatives that have been successful in addressing the needs and concerns.
If I may begin, obviously,
Sure.
as a former director of the Transition Year Program at Dalhousie University, and Bernadette paid tribute to Burnley Rocky Jones, and I think his critical role, not only in Nova Scotia but Canada, has to be given the recognition he deserves. And as someone who, and it's hard to believe that I, over 30 years, been involved in the TYP, directing it for a considerable period of time, and that it was deeply humbling that he said the TYP was probably the most important initiative we've been involved in. So the TYP has been around since 1970, and having it targeted specifically to the historical Black Nova Scotian community, the African Nova Scotian community, was extremely important in recognizing, as he said, that the Black students he saw on campus were either from Africa or the Caribbean, that obviously something had to be done to address the marginalization, disenfranchisement, particularly in the public education system that had impacted on Black Nova Scotians. And I think it's played a central role in terms of empowering the community and generating not only graduates, but people becoming very important leaders. The fact that more than 50 years later, we still need a TYP speaks to the void, shall we say, and that's an understatement in the system, the failure. It's interesting to note that later this year, which will be November of this year, we'll be marking the 30th anniversary of the Black Report, the launch of the Black Report, which was this historic effort by the African Nova Scotian community to examine in detail and to establish a definitive and unchallengeable case about the inequities that existed in the system, not only historically, but continue to exist today. That not just the legacy, but the ongoing processes, right? You know, we often talk about colonialism and post-colonialism. I always like to argue that, you know, those processes that were engendered under colonialism changed form and shape and still continue to operate today. And of course, in the history, and I shouldn't say this, but I have a pet peeve. You know, I'm writing a piece called Black Erasure within Canadian historiography. Quite often when people talk about colonialism, they don't talk about the presence of people of African descent and how they were part of this colonial dispossession, part of this colonial disempowerment and so forth. And so I think the TYP speaks to, one, an important initiative aimed specifically at the community, acknowledge the history of the community, but also speaks that such limited programs without fundamental, as Rocky said at the end of his life, fundamental wholesale structural and systemic change will lead to the point that we only end up having to have these programs, right? Instead of actually seeing the fact that they've served their purposes, as people have alluded, particularly in the introduction, to creating a more equitable society where we don't need these things, right? And I think the 30th anniversary of the Black Report will serve to reflect not just on the education system itself, how much has not changed, but specifically how much more needs to change in the society.
Yeah. I want to back up. Oh, go ahead, Delvina. Sorry.
I was just going to jump right in behind there as well to talk about educational initiatives, because having spent most of my career in education, that's first top of my mind. And Isaac did mention the Black Report, which I think is absolutely the most seminal document that has guided educational development in this province. It really is. And although we may look through it and say there are still things that need to be implemented, it has ushered in so many things. And when we think of the work that has happened with the Afrocentric Learning Institute and the Delmore Buddy Day Institute, I mean, those two initiatives alone, and the fact that when I think of the master's cohort, Afrocentric Leadership, which was created by our community and was housed and taught at Mount St. Vincent University, it produced over 60 graduates. Barb, you were involved at one point in time, people like Karen Hudson and many others, Charles Shepard, and I could go on with the names, but it was an honor to be able to lead that initiative and to see where those 60-odd people have landed in their career, and that they have become huge catalysts for change in our system at the school board level, at the level of the Department of Education, and many of them have found their way into the Nova Scotia Community College, and they have become important levers for championing education for all African Nova Scotians. So I just mentioned those ones because I would be remiss not to say something about education, given how I've had the opportunity and blessing to witness how hard we have worked as a community to put initiatives like that in place. But having said that, I'm not here to be the naysayer, but I'll just throw out this. One of the areas that I'm also deeply passionate about and deeply involved in is the culture sector. And that as much as we have made a lot of individual progress in terms of artists, we could just name folks that are doing great things, whether it's the Tara Taylor, David Woods, or all of our fantastic musicians, African Nova Scotian Music Association. The fact remains, though, so I just put that out there for those who are listening, because in case you're called upon to do work, to do your part, is that we do need policies for the culture sector. We do need policies. We get it. We have initiatives, but policy is key and catalytic to how should I put it? For ensuring and for entrenching. That's what I want to say. For entrenching the change, so that it doesn't just fade away as people move along the chain of their career, and then there is no institutional memory of what has to continue. So I just put that out there. I didn't want to start off. I also underlined some of the many things that have happened positively in the culture sector, but join in with this desire to have policy there in the same way that we do have policies in education and so forth.
Yeah, I would add. So the introduction about education being critically important in our communities over centuries really is a nice segue into legal education. And in terms of the IBNM initiative, really, having people legally trained to go out and enforce rights and to help build institutions like the ANSJI. So I have to just pause there to say, just sitting here right now and seeing the ANSJI in reality, as it has been for a number of years now, it's really almost overwhelming because you can feel the legacy, the energy of our ancestors who tried to build institutions through the AUBA and institutionalize our networks that way. And the NSAACP, my grandmother was a founding member of that, and BUFF. And this is the latest iteration of that dream and that journey toward African Nova Scotian liberation and freedom. And I think that is one of the most exciting and moving aspects of this work. This is for the next, as our Indigenous brothers and sisters teach us, for the next 7 generations, right? What are we creating now going forward? And so, to me, a critical aspect of all of the work across sectors and areas has been that there's this nugget, this this spiritual centering of African Nova Scotian liberation that runs through all of it. And I think it's key to keep that in mind as we think about going forward with the work. So the legal dimension that comes in, and I tell all of my students, I have a love-hate relationship with the law. The law, as critical race theory tells us, has been incredibly oppressive. It's been used by the powerful to hold other people down. That's been its real usage over time. And so the transformation that's possible when people who come in who've been excluded, who come in and take that and say, we're going to take the best of it and turn it around and use it for liberation.
Yeah.
That's exciting. And that's important in that we have policy, but at the end of the day, somebody's got to enforce our rights.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to hold oppressors accountable for our continued oppression and racism, all the other words that go with it and all the intersections with that. And law is a tool, together with community action and a whole bunch of other things, that enables us to do that work in a way that we were prevented from doing in the past. And so I'm excited about the way in which that adds a dimension to the critical work that's happening in all these other sectors.
Thank you. And as you all talked about, and Isaac, you mentioned the erasure and the colonization of people of African descent, and we know we're sitting here and thinking about and talking about African Nova Scotians. So one of my questions is, why is, and you all talked about different organizations that existed specifically for African Nova Scotia, so why do you think it's important in defining African Nova Scotians and African Nova Scotian communities, as we think about the organizations that have developed and the existence of African Nova Scotians in this province, in this country for over 400 years? Why is that important?
No,
I'm asking anybody who wants to chime in. I was just
Good, because
making the points.
I've made some notes for that one.
Yeah, go ahead, Delvina.
I made notes for all of them, but this in particular speaks to me because the whole notion of why it's important to preserve African Nova Scotian identity. I did my first deep dive into this question of African Nova Scotian identity formation in the 1980s. When I was a music producer, singer, songwriter with the women's a cappella group For the Moment. Because all across the country, wherever we went and wherever our music was played, music industry pundits and connoisseurs and cultural aficionados couldn't quite understand where our distinct sound came from. They couldn't understand that. They felt that this isn't part of Canada. They kept thinking it was from like the United States or something. They didn't understand what we have going on here in Nova Scotia, and that we have this distinct way of relating to phenomena that produces that kind of sound. So we had to explain that to our public, which led our group to take a deep dive into our history, our culture, and our identity. So here's something I found from those early days that I want to share with you. I'm going to do some reading here. That'll keep me closer to time. So, I love this. To fully appreciate the distinctiveness of African Nova Scotian culture, one must understand something of the distinctiveness of African Nova Scotian history. An African-American scholar by the name of Houston Baker, in 1992, he characterized the relationship between identity, history, and culture in the following way. The only way to arrive at understanding of the African-American culture, is to fully comprehend the history of African-American people. This is what he says. The proposition here is that the history of a culture is, in effect, the culture and the identity. Since culture is not something that one displays, but rather is something that one lives. So I'll put it this way, as it says here. So our task here today or anytime is to chronicle the history of a whole way of life known as African Nova Scotian culture and identity, which is distinct and in many ways separate from another whole way of life known as simply Nova Scotian culture. So I found that so fascinating and interesting that to look at identity and culture as our history. And that is the focal point of what is being said here. Let somebody else jump in on that.
If I may?
Yeah.
So, I mean, as a historian, one of the most important things, obviously, is approaching this as I do from looking at the history. And it's clear that African Nova Scotians possess, a common cultural and historical experience that binds them as a people. Now, my latest work, and I work a lot on Cuba, I work a lot in Africa, but I'm writing a theoretical piece where I look at African Nova Scotians not just as a distinct people, but as almost a quasi-nation, right? And I'm using the comparison historically with the Black Nation thesis that was used in the U.S. South. Okay, which was established specifically because there was a very strong argument coming from the Garvey movement and then through very much leftist Marxist circles that the Black population at that time in the U.S. South constituted a distinct nation, right? And therefore, with all the rights of self-determination, including up to secession. I'm not saying that's on the cards here, but it's clear that also combined with this experience of disenfranchisement, marginalized exploitation, has been, as Delvina's pointed out, others have pointed out, a history of agency, of struggling for their rights, of establishing organizations that are not simply social constructs, but represent this common historical trajectory. One of the issues of some of the communities of African descent that have come later is not understanding this specific history, why there needs to be specific programs to address a particular history of disenfranchisement that also resonates with the struggle of the community itself, despite its conditions to assert its right to self-determination. But also as a historian, and as we were talking about this as well, and I'm the coordinator of the Black and African Diaspora Studies program at Dalhousie University that recently established, and I happened to have the bittersweet experience of sitting down with my colleague who was recently hired to have a tea in one of the bakeries that are now established in Gottingen Street. And it's a bittersweet experience because I have a sweet tooth and I love those French pastries at the NLF Bakery. I have to admit that, okay? But it was deeply disturbing, because the entire community has been gentrified. And it's amazing to see how in the blink of an eye, an entire community can disappear. And I remember talking to Tracy Williams, who I run into because he works at my daughter's, my 6-year-old daughter's school, Duke Danville, and we often, people probably know he was a member of the Universal Soul. And I remember talking about being in the community recently and feeling like a stranger, right? And so one of the fundamental things as well is this historical memory is disappearing. I know I've spoken with you, Barb, and others as well, about how many Black communities exist merely as memories, right? And fading memories as they're systematically dispossessed. So one of the issues I have is also preserving this memory is important to struggle as well, right? And one of the central things we do in the Black and African Diaspora Studies, while looking at the distinctiveness and uniqueness of the African Nova Scotian experience, and placing it and locating it within the Black experience in America as a whole, is going back and preserving this memory, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think this is one of the critical things as a historian, that these memories have to be preserved, not just simply as we have for the church, the AME Zion Baptist Church at the corner of Falklands Garden, where we have probably a not frequently looked at panel, okay, that operates, but something that preserves this history and preserves the existing communities and so on. This is part and parcel of the ongoing struggle. So as Professor William was spoken, as Michelle was speaking about, right, the struggle within the legal system, it's also part and parcel of a struggle in society to avoid historical erasure, but also disempowerment. Now, the last point I'll make as well is the last census, it's very hard to get the data from the last Canadian census on the Black Nova Scotian community. You have to do it by postal code, right? Okay, and they will charge you a lot to disaggregate the data. But if you go back to the National Housing Survey, which was this truncated survey that was done under the Harper administration, the results for the African Nova Scotian community were truly dispiriting, right? In terms of the gap in income and so forth. And that gap in income is not an artifact, it's not some sort of anomaly that's inexplicable. It's rooted in the history of this community, right? Where the Black Nova Scotian community, through the existence of slavery, okay, through the exploitation of the Black loyalists, the Black refugees, the Maroons, and what happened in Cape Breton and so forth, were placed into, what shall we say, a very segregated and deliberately segregated, I would say, labor system, which was reflected in the education system. We're still struggling against this history, right? So while we may seem here privileged, I'm a professor at Dalhousie University. I often spoke, my mother is a Black loyalist, right? Was a Black loyalist. She's passed on, but was from a Black loyalist community that came in 1783. When I speak about the experiences, I can understand it as a historian, but I'm separated from it in terms of my material position in society, right? But we have to understand that for the vast majority of African Nova Scotians, this economic disenfranchisement and marginalization continues. And that's part and parcel of the struggle we face, right? In terms of creating an equitable and socially just society.
Thank you.
Thanks. Again, it's helpful to have that and build on it. I was just sitting here thinking, it's interesting that to some degree we're answering the question of, why is African Nova Scotian distinct culture important? And, the really basic answer is your culture is important. Mm-hmm. Everybody's culture is important. So why is it special that we need to establish or justify that our culture is important to us? So at some level, it feels very basic, but I know it's much more complex in other ways. So we talk about the definition of African Nova Scotians being a distinct people, which we are. So it's beyond a definition, right? It's a truth. And there's so many facets to that, and a lot of it, as our speakers have said here, is shaped obviously by our history, from the way in which we've had to overcome so much, and that shapes who we are as a people. Our resilience is one word that tends to be overused. Resilience means you're tired too, but we're more than the racism and oppression that we've experienced. And I think that's a critical part of who we are. We are not, our identity doesn't start and stop by what was done to us. We have created a unique culture, social interactions, spiritual traditions, economic networks, political engagements. Like on every dimension of a people, we are unique in how we have grown and created ourselves, and that is really important. And the other aspect, I think, that's really important, that sort of combines the two is, and my colleague Delvina is working on this extensively, as are many others, is we are owed reparations. We can't get into this historical reductionism. Oh, that was in the past. You all, or a plaque is who we are. You hear people talk about us as an historic something. I don't know about you all, but I'm living here today in the present. So, of course, you remember your history, but we are a dynamic people, contemporary right now, who are suffering from the structural oppression that was visited upon us for centuries, that actually privileged and transferred wealth to other people on our backs, literally, that has yet to be repaid. So, it's critically important to document, to gather around, to value, to treasure the contributions that we made, and to say there is a lot that we are owed for that. Enslavement, not just the unpaid labor of enslavement, but how do you, if you think about tort law, how do you value somebody who, heaven forbid, lost an arm or a limb, right? What money do we put on that? Well, then if you trace back to how do you compensate someone who, excuse me, was sexually violated for their entire existence by someone who legally owned them? Or had their children taken from them to make money for somebody? It's really hard to talk about, actually, quite honestly. Because it's not actually about money entirely, it's about harm. It's about the legacy of all of that, the legacy of broken promises around land allocation that was Mi'kmaq land, but was promised to us to come and work it, and we were never paid for that. All of these things need to be captured, documented, quantified, and repaired. And so that's a critical aspect of us as a distinct people that has yet to be resolved, and we have work to do on that. And so we don't need to be defending ourselves about being a distinct people. We have a mission in that direction that has to be fulfilled. And if you look at some of the leadership that's happening around those questions in the US, just to talk to you about what we're talking about, the legacy of people of African descent who were enslaved, or as they call in the US, American descendants of slaves, and they have economists working on these questions. And if you actually provided reparations to people of African descent around the world, you would turn the global economy upside down and inside out. Mm-hmm. In the US alone, in terms of reparations, they have calculated it to be $42 trillion. So I don't share that to talk about money, or anything like that, to say it's indicative of how we have built the world, including here in Nova Scotia, and our unique contributions and what was taken from us here. And there's a reckoning to be had, and that requires us and others to understand who we are as a people.
Barb,
If I may add one thing to what Misha
Where is it going now?
But there's one poignant historical fact I think that's important when it comes particularly to education. So this year, people are celebrating in the US the 70th anniversary of Topeka versus Brown of School Board of Education, right? Yeah. And of course, one of the problems we have is, we tend to be so US-centered in talking, not just about the Nova Scotian, but even the Canadian Black experience, right? What people don't know is that 70 years since education was officially desegregated in Nova Scotia. So if you look at the public education system, was officially celebrated as the first Public Education Act, I think, remember correct, is 1811. In Nova Scotia. So from 1811 to 1954 is 143 years. From 1954 to now is 70 years. So people in the African Nova Scotians have been educated more or less twice as long in a deliberately unequal, unfair system, than in a system that's supposedly, and we say supposedly, at least legally, unsegregated, right? That says a lot about the profound legacy, right? And this point about the money, we know that Nova Scotian elites were deeply tied into the transatlantic slave trade. We know that the number of enslaved Africans in Nova Scotia is much larger than people normally thought, right? But the point about the money, I think, is this, is that when Michelle says that will upend the world economy, reparations isn't simply about money. It's about transforming the social relations, both within and between nations, right? Mm-hmm. And so Black liberation necessarily means liberation of all of humanity. Because historically, the dispossession and the attempted extermination of the indigenous peoples, stolen land and then stolen labor on stolen land, right? The merciless exploitations of African labor created the world we live in today, right? And by addressing these issues, not only do we transform the conditions of these particular groups of peoples who suffered the most from colonialism, people of African descent, indigenous peoples, we will transform the world's social relations, which will benefit all of humanity. And we only have to look at the world today to see the dangers the world faces.
Thanks.
Wonderful. I like that we are working so hard to define and to really have the larger society accept the fact that we are a distinct culture, a distinct people. We have a distinct identity. But I'm more interested in the question of what does that look like? Mm-hmm. Because especially as the conversation of reparatory justice butts up against identity and culture, especially as we think in the past number of decades that we have had many institutions, organizations, and especially the educational sector calling for initiatives that are culture specific, that are designed around our identity, that are designed around who we are and the tenets of who we are. That's another significant reason to define what African Nova Scotian culture is. Because if we're gonna hang our programming, if we're gonna hang our path forward on the notion of an African Nova Scotian identity and a distinct culture, we have to enumerate and name what that looks like. So the project I'm interested in is defining the axioms of African Nova Scotian culture. So I posit there's many, 7 key and catalytic elements of what constitutes our distinctness as a people. I had the opportunity back in the 1990s to spend time with a gentleman from Zimbabwe who created a model on axioms of African culture. And he spent a great deal of time with me as I was trying to define the question of then what are the tenets and the axioms of African Nova Scotian culture. And so I know it got resolved to these initial elements. And I wish I had been able to put the model up there. And one of the key ones was spirituality and humanness, oppression and resistance, and how that has defined us to become who we are. That our resistance culture, the oppression that we experience, but then the resistance culture. Another one is our myths, our beliefs, our aesthetic and artistic expression. These are some of the things that we can define, that we can enumerate, that make us who we are. The centrality of the Black church is an important axiom to define African Nova Scotian distinctiveness and culture. Communal responsibility, even if you don't do it, we value it. It's a critical value that's been drilled into us from get. Right. It's been totally drilled into us. Family anchorage. We know, and we talk about it all the time, academically, theoretically, and in the practical, and we always refer to the power of the Black family to always be that anchor that sustains us through all that we have endured over the decades and over the centuries. And the fact that the individual is a communal self, that we really value that. Yes, we want people to be individually successful, to be individually ambitious, but at the end of all of that, we hold on dear to that value set of the individual being communal, that not deliberately or overtly or in a way prioritizing our individual needs over the community. And that's also an important tenet of the axioms of African Nova Scotian culture. And I, as I said, I took my deep dive into this. I'm reading here from a paper, and I've been dancing with this notion of defining our culture for a long time. And I'm reading from a paper that I wrote 32 years ago. I'm reading from, so we've been dancing with this for a long time.
We have.
When I was asked, I went, and I couldn't even open the file because it's too old, but I had some hard copies of it. 46 pages, an examination of the axioms of African Nova Scotian culture. Gotta get it retyped and put, because I can't seem to get fun.
Trying to put in the archive.
I know. That's right. That's right. And then let ChatGPT do the rest or something like that. Yeah. But I need to say, Correct. We really have to bear down as we have the conversation about a distinct culture. We have to define what it is because we're trying to hang so many things on that, right? And here's my fear. We don't want to be like the lottery winners. All the statistics show that people who win the lottery, they don't do well. It disappears. So if tomorrow the government said, you wonderful, distinct African Nova Scotian people, I've got my checkbook. Those reparations you've been asking for, we're going to write it up to the tunes of the billions. What would be our strategy? What would be our guiding principles? What would be our axioms to point us north, south, east, and west so that we don't spend that on Eurocentric designed models of how to uplift ourselves? That's my concern. That's my question. So I'd love to see this discussion of African Nova Scotian distinctiveness be elaborated to define the axioms of African Nova Scotian culture. And one of the key things in my research that I'm doing on reparatory justice is infusing the Afrocentric model, because I'm highly critical of some of the very fantastic work, by the way, that is happening out of the Caribbean and the United States, but especially the Caribbean, because they really, this time around, more so than the last time around when it was coming really out of the African Union in the earlier conversations in the 90s with and so forth, that they have really led this current round of conversation and push towards the CARICOM, the push towards reparatory justice. But there's a complete absence of any Afrocentric model to guide that work. So same for them. If tomorrow, and they have said they're challenging Britain, if tomorrow Britain wrote them a check, I don't think with the way that they're currently operating that there would be a clear path to liberatory models and programs that would change, substantially the way in which power relationships, gender relationships, and all the other things that define us would bring about the changes that they so desire. So getting to the nitty-gritty of the axioms and the Afrocentric modalities is critical in this conversation of a distinct people.
I know you wanted to add something, Michelle. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we are not the only ones figuring this out. In that there's an international human rights category called Afro-descendants. And it includes any groups who were essentially forcibly moved to the Americas because of the enslavement that happened. And so our experiences are unique. They also have some commonalities with African Americans, with Afro-Brazilians, with the Garifuna people in Central America, all of whom are, if you think about it, not in majority Black countries, but were forced into the countries where they find themselves through the slave trade. And so there's a parallel, or there's a category in international law that recognizes distinct peoples like African Nova Scotians. And so I think that's both reassuring and also sad in some ways, right? That this has happened to so many peoples across the Americas, but we're not alone in some of our experiences.
I don't know if any of you are getting as inspired as me, but I'm looking to my friend Robert, and he and I have been working, sort of, on one of our books that we're hoping to do. And so this has inspired me to rethink about one of the books we want to write, because thinking about this topic, and when you talk about the history being lost and people not knowing who we are as African Nova Scotians and the distinctiveness of us, we need to get this down in writing. And all of you have papers right in front of you in terms of in your minds, and then even Delvina in that 30-year paper that you're going through, that's already there. and ready to be published in a chapter book that Robert and I are going to really start putting our minds to, because we need to capture this, and it needs to be in our school system. So we'll be tapping the three of you. And so in saying that and looking at our audience, and I think it's really important to get an understanding of what we mean when we talk about African Nova Scotians as a distinct people, but also how that may make us different than some of our Caribbean and African brothers and sisters. So our intent is not to say we're separate from, or, woe is us, but to talk about our experiences. So when people ask you, in terms of this definition, when we think about that, can you share, discuss the difference between African Nova Scotians and our continental African or Caribbean brothers and sisters living in Nova Scotia? And it's an important question as well, because when we think about policy, when we think about government, when we think about Canada, and how we use the term African Nova Scotians and how others use the term African Nova Scotians, can you talk a little bit about that distinctiveness of our Caribbean and our brothers and sisters from the continent? I know that's a hard question, but it's also an easy question.
For me, when I think that being able to bridge both of them, having grown up a good portion of my life in Trinidad and Tobago, visiting my family in Amherst, Nova Scotia, right? Rural Nova Scotia, rural black community in Nova Scotia every 2 or 3 years, right? And so I think that the real distinctiveness, in a sense, is a lack of understanding of the nature of Canada itself. Of course, 2 generations down the road, a lot of Caribbean immigrants are now dealing with the fact that Canada is a racist society. Okay, that's a fact. Okay, many of them came with the hopes, right, and dreams. Okay, like for example, give you a clear example. Some of you are familiar with Rosie Douglas, right? Rosie Douglas became Prime Minister of Dominica, was a very important person who played an important role in the Sir George Williams event and a whole number of things. What some people don't realize is he ends up in Canada because he called John Diefenbaker's office, who was a Conservative Prime Minister, comes to Canada, right, and actually is a member of the Progressive Conservative Party, right? And then his experiences in Canada radicalized him, right, okay? And of course, I think his discussions with Rocky Jones, okay, because Rocky was in Toronto when he became politicized. And Rocky began to talk to many of them about the experiences of African Nova Scotians, right? That you have a population that's been here several centuries and have structurally faced these kind of marginalization, discrimination, disenfranchisement, right? So I think the first thing is a lack of understanding of Canadian history, okay? I witnessed that, and you were there, Barb. We were at a conference to discuss the Scarborough Charter, which is a very important document for Canadian University, Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism. And then there was a panel to talk about Black studies in Canada, right? And of course, there were 2 things. One, it was very American-centric, okay? And second, it didn't mention Nova Scotia. Okay? So I think there's this lack of understanding of the history here, right? And there's also a lack of understanding that there's a very specific reason why, for example, we have certain outcomes in the education system, we have certain levels of unemployment and so forth, that comes from this particular history, right? Comes from these processes continue to operate, which leads to a level of misunderstanding and so forth. So as director of TYP, people would ask me, why do you need a TYP? Why can't you open it up to other people as well, right? To make it focus on it. And I'd point out there's a specific history here, right, that exists and so forth. So that's the first thing I think that really stands up, is a lack of an understanding of this particular history that they only learn about once they either individually experience it or their children begin to experience it as they grew up within Canadian society as well, right? Okay? That's not an unbridgeable divide. It's not an antagonism it's not a contradiction that has to be antagonistic. It can be bridged through understanding and through education and so forth. And so that's one particular point I'd like to outline. There's other points, but I think we can have other voices.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Isaac. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Just sort of underlining what Isaac has eloquently stated is this bond that we have as people in this place is it's not just family or familial. It's because of our collective marginalization, our collective economic underdevelopment, our collective political domination and psychological dislocation. These things all go together here. We've experienced this together. People jokingly say trauma bonding. Well, that's exactly what we have done. We have bonded because of our trauma. That defines why we are distinct together. That is not to say that our sisters and brothers from the continent, from South America, in the Caribbean and other parts of the African diaspora have also experienced the very same kind of thing in terms of the trauma that we have experienced globally. But it's unique and distinct for each group. What people experience, and I spent the last 30 years spending lots of time in the Caribbean. I lived there for a year or so. And, and I go there as often and so very, very often. It's not, their traumas and their issues are not the same as ours. We have points of intersection, many of them. And that is true, Barb, you have spent a lot of time in Ghana and in West Africa. And I know that we've had those conversations. You see, how we like to go for the return, and we have all tried to make our way there to West Africa, and we see ourselves reflected there, but still, their trauma and their situations deserve to be recognized for what they are for the folks there. And we can't claim their history of oppression any more than they can claim ours. But we can crosstalk. And that, I think, goes to Isaac's point that it's the education. For people to understand that. Because some people will say, well, we've been oppressed too, right? But it's very different also. The wheels of colonialism, which is colonial oppression in parts of the continent of Africa, is one thing. Some countries never saw enslavement. They've seen colonial abuse, right? But we did that passage, and that informs us differently and has created a different kind of psychological dislocation than what they have. And that can't just be sort of claimed by virtue of moving here. You have to have lived it. You have to have experienced. We have that intergenerational trauma that belongs to us. We would love to give it away. But it's with us. We have to live it and learn through it and transform our psychology to be able to become a whole people.
Thank you.
And perhaps a way of looking at it historically is that, later groups of people have, and as a Marxist Pan-Africanist, I believe this is an unbridgeable divide. I believe in a united black struggle globally, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. Okay, just as reparations will look differently for different communities of Africa, where you're in the world. In Canada, the exploitation of Africans as first slave labor, and then the exploitation of labor of the black royalists and the black refugees and so forth, is part and parcel of building this colonial settler state. I think that's important to bear in mind. A big failure, and there's a recent book that just won a big award. George Elliott Clark has just written a review of it, because I was having lunch with him in Toronto, and I said, listen, you got to review this book, because your rapier wit will be powerful for really bringing out its failure to address that when you talk about colonization, and the process of colonization, the exploitation of African labor, the dehumanizations of Africans, of people of African descent in Canada, okay, what was to become Canada, was central to that, right? And so what happens is African Nova Scotians are the historical community is part of the formation of this colonial settler state. And all of its discontents and horrors, right? Other communities come afterwards. They're products of colonial processes in other parts of the world, but they're disconnected from understanding how this Canada was created. And Canada is very, very, very good at trying to create this image of not being the United States, of being a friendlier, gentler colonization, or a place where slavery never took place. And I'll end with this point. It was mentioned, and Bernadette mentioned, the UN group of experts who came in 2016 and produced this report in 2017. There was an earlier report in the 1990s, in the follow-up to the Durban conference in 2001. And the UN came here and it saw the condition of Black Canadians, and particularly African Nova Scotians.
Yes.
And they wrote a scathing report.
They did.
And what happened was Jean Chrétien, who was then the Prime Minister, called in one of the leading Black political representatives, I won't say who it was, and they told me personally, and screamed at this particular person, right? Because Canada's image of being this perfect society, international, this image, right, was wrecked. So one of the things is that image of presenting Canada as being this wonderful, multiculturally mosaic, which is not vertically stratified, is something they sell very well in the rest of the world. And when people come here and experience that, no, it's not like this, it's a shock to them. And sometimes this cognitive dissonance allows them perhaps to sort of try and erase that from their memory. Right? And I think, in a sense, the role that African Nova Scotians play is this collective historical memory to say, no, this is what Canada is really like. And this is what you will face and your future generations will face.
Thank you, thank you.
But you know what bonds us, though? I just gotta say, picking up on Isaac's point, when I think of the seminal work by Walter Rodney, how colonialism underdeveloped Africa, and then I think about African-American Manning Maribel's book, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, and I think about us, and I feel like the title of the book that I need to write is How Racism Underdeveloped Black Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
Generation number 3. But what's so interesting about this is that here we are geopolitically in one of the most affluent, societies, nations, and economic worlds, economic countries in the world. And how is it that our underdevelopment mirrors that of the Caribbean?
Yeah.
Or Africa? So because we are a nation in a nation. And our underdevelopment and all the modalities that have worked to undermine our growth and development as human beings is exacting to what has happened in Africa under colonialism, or in America under capitalism and racism and enslavement, and us, as so-called indentured servants, but still the very systemic neglect. Okay, the systemic neglect, and we know there's many stories that can be enumerated for that, everything from education to everything from the land granting system that sowed our fate, that here we are, having a economic trajectory that looks like we're from Guyana or Ghana or any of the countries that have been, fully disenfranchised through the colonial rule, enslavement, etc. And that shouldn't be with us here in this affluent place.
I'm going to let Michelle weigh in, and then we're going to open up at least for one question from the audience. I know you just want to make one point, but we all want to make just one point, and I just want to hear from Michelle, and then we'll go to the audience, and then there's lunch, and we can talk then. I'm trying my best to keep all these scholars on task, and it's not easy. So we'll go to you, Michelle, and then we'll open it up.
Mine's just a brief one, just to say that the shared wisdom that we unfortunately have experienced over our generations of knowing how to navigate, how to build institutions in the face of the worst oppression possible that we've endured, that wisdom, I think, is something that is a gift and a point of commonality with other people who've come in order to help navigate this system that other people may not be aware of. And I think as an example of Carl James, who came down some years ago, the educator out of Toronto, who was talking about how they're seeing statistically in terms of educational outcomes that the third and fourth generation of people who came from the Caribbean, their children are now suffering similar statistical outcomes in the education system that we've endured for centuries. And so I think there's a lot that we can share to say, this is how you address those things, or this is what we've done and worked, and this is what we've done and haven't worked. And that's a point of commonality, I think.